This podcast features criminologists discussing sensitive themes and topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Sentenced to life for the murder of her mother, this woman still claims her innocence decades later. This is the Nikki Zinger story. Hi, listeners. We have a special treat today. While Megan is enjoying some time with her new baby, we have some of our friends filling in as guest hosts. So while we will all miss Megan for these few weeks, we know that you will enjoy hearing from some experts who are doing incredible work to bring light to injustice. Today, we have a very special guest, our brilliant friend, Maggie Freleng. Hi, Maggie.
Hey, Amy.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I am stoked. I really am. You guys know I've been a long-time listener, and it's great to see your face since I left New York.
Yes, I didn't know if we could bring that up, but yes, I'm sad to hear that you left New York, but I am psyched to visit you in Austin. So
Yes, you have to come down.
Yes. All right, well, most of our listeners probably already know Maggie because she is a superstar. But for those of you who are meeting her for the first time, Maggie is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and producer who reports on wrongful convictions, the criminal legal system, and social issues. She is the host and producer of the award-winning podcast Wrongful Conviction with Maggie Freleng, as well as Murder and Alliance and Unjust and Unsolved. As if that wasn't enough, she is also the host and producer of the Pulitzer Prize-winning podcast Suave on PRX. Maggie has won countless awards for her incredible work and has been featured in some of the top media outlets such as Rolling Stone, the LA Times, Vulture, People, the Boston Globe, the list goes on. Today, Maggie joins us to discuss a case that is very near and dear to her. Maggie, you reported on Nikki's case on your podcast, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Most recently, you reported on your Wrongful Conviction podcast. That was just this past January.
Yeah, and then when I was doing my podcast Unjust and Unsolved, the one before this, I think I reported on Nikki. It was back in 2019. Mm-hmm. So Nikki and I have been talking for quite a while.
Yeah. And I have to say, Maggie, that was the first time I ever heard of Nikki Zinger. And Nikki's case, as you know, has received very little attention. So I wouldn't be surprised if most of our listeners have never heard of her either. So this might be the first time for many of you. So let's jump in and meet Nikki Zinger. Nikki was born on December 21st, 1963 in Chicago, Illinois. By the time she was around 1 year old, her parents had moved to Magnolia, Arkansas. Now, that's a small city in southwest Arkansas that is home to Southern Arkansas University. Unfortunately, Nikki's father was an alcoholic and abusive to her mother, Linda, and he left the family not long after their move to Arkansas. Nikki also had several other hardships, as she was born with a club foot and other physical disabilities. And as a child, she had to endure dozens of surgeries. Now, this would start when she was an infant, and it would continue until she was a young teenager. And due to Nikki's medical issues and the ongoing surgeries and the recovery times needed for after the surgeries, Linda homeschooled Nikki with the help of hired tutors. And Linda didn't only homeschool her daughter, she was also working really hard to support her and give her a good life. Linda worked long hours as a nurse, and Linda and Nikki were more just mother and daughter. They were really best friends. They had no other family but each other, and the two were extremely close. And when Nikki was old enough, she also started pitching in financially as much as she could. Although she was disabled, she babysat and worked at a daycare center. When Nikki was in her early 20s, she married a man named Larry, but the relationship only lasted a few months. He was reportedly a heavy drinker and verbally abusive, so Nikki quickly returned to her mother. Tragedy would strike the small family soon after Nikki's divorce, as Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer and had to undergo surgery, radiation, and chemo. She was often very sick from the cancer and the treatments, so Nikki spent much of her time caring for her mother. But a bright spot emerged in 1990, as at the age of 26, Nikki met Daniel Risher, who was 22 at the time, and the attraction was instant, and the two began a relationship. The couple would split their time between living with Daniel's family and staying with Linda. And things seemed to be going great. They were a happy young couple. That is until Sunday, March 10th, 1991, when Linda didn't show up to shopping with her friend. Now, Linda's shopping friend was her next-door neighbor, and the woman had seen Linda on Friday, March 8th, getting her mail at her mailbox around 5 p.m. And Linda was dressed in her scrubs, so we can assume that she was just getting home from work. When her friend called to confirm their shopping trip for Sunday morning, now we're talking about March 10th, Linda didn't answer. Her friend was worried and went across the lawn to see if Linda was all right. But when she arrived, she found that the back door had been kicked in. She immediately called Linda's best friend, Jan Terrell, who arrived and called a police officer friend, Buddy Height. Buddy then called other police who entered Linda's residence and found her laying in her den, brutally stabbed and beaten to death, and her trailer had been ransacked. An autopsy would later reveal that not only had Linda been stabbed 12 times and had received several blows to the head, causing multiple skull fractures, there were also signs of strangulation. Okay, Maggie, thanks for bearing with me for some of those early details. Now, I know that you've done a lot of work on this case. What were investigators thinking early on when they first arrived on this scene?
So early on, it was pretty clear they believed that Linda had just gotten home from work. She was still in her scrubs, her wig. She did have cancer, as we mentioned. So her wig was in her bedroom. So it looked like she'd just gotten home, was, walking around the kitchen, and someone broke in. What they thought was that it looked like it had been staged. So from the beginning, this did not actually seem like a robbery. Nothing was really taken. And it just seemed like, someone had staged this. They thought Linda wouldn't answer the door without her wig for someone she didn't know. So it was assumed that this was someone she knew. She felt comfortable with them without her wig on. They found glass from the back door on top of items that were strewn around the kitchen. So these were all instances that made them think like, okay, this is a staged incident.
Yeah, and I found that part interesting, and it took me a while to wrap my head around it, but if somebody had broken in and then ransacked the apartment, then you would expect the glass to be under the items, but they found it the other way around, so that seems like a huge red flag to me.
Yeah, and it reminds me kind of Darley's case. Mm-hmm. Wasn't there an instance with Darley's case as well? And you might be more of an expert on that than me at this point, because I actually haven't covered Darley. But it sounds similar.
You're talking about there was like a window in that case, and the way the window was broken, They thought it looked suspicious. You need to cover that case. I would love to hear you cover that one.
I know. We've been working on it.
Oh, good. For a while now, if I remember, right?
Yeah. So she's agreed to an interview. It's just, there's always things in the works. And her, as well, I had reached out to her actually the same time I reached out to Nikki. So I've talked to Darley equally as long, but so similarly, this just didn't look like someone was breaking in to attack her or rob her. It seemed like there was another motive.
And for those of you who may not know who we're talking about Darley Roudier, who is currently incarcerated for the murder of her children, and a lot of people believe that she is in fact wrongfully convicted. We did cover her early on, so keep an eye out for Maggie's coverage, and you can go back and listen to ours meanwhile. Okay, so let's get back to Nikki's case. So this was the scene when Nikki and Daniel walked in Sunday morning. Nikki had tried calling her mom several times on Saturday the 9th, and she found it odd that Linda never picked up the phone. So they decided that they would drive over Sunday morning to see if she was okay. And they were beyond shocked to find out that she had been murdered, especially since on Friday, March 8th, the couple had stopped by Linda's trailer on their way to Shreveport, Louisiana. And what were they going to Shreveport for? Does Nikki talk about that?
Yeah, so Daniel was a musician. Nikki actually talks to me about how that was one of the things that she was really attracted to about Daniel. He was this musician. They were both kind of rockers. That plays into their case too, especially during this time, a lot of the satanic panic. They liked Iron Maiden and bands like that. So they had gone that day to Shreveport to fix one of Daniel's amps, like a music amp for his guitar or whatever instrument he played. And they, went to the mall. They just hung out, got some fast food. I kind of feel like I remember it was a Sonic. And it was just a normal day for two 20-somethings.
Yeah. And I believe they also drove by Linda's home on their way home. They did see her car parked in the driveway, but the lights were off, so they had assumed that she had gone to bed.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And Nikki had mentioned to me, actually, in retrospect, she wonders if her mom was still alive when they drove by or if she was laying there dead.
Yeah, there's no way to know, but what a haunting thought to think that you could have gotten there maybe earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure this was all devastating for Nikki, but cops asked her if she could identify if anything was missing from the trailer since she had lived there part-time. And I believe Nikki told them that there were some items missing, such as Linda's gun, a hammer, cash, jewelry. So it seems like Nikki's cooperating, but she quickly becomes a suspect. Now, what is it about Nikki that made investigators automatically look at her and Daniel?
So Nikki's mother had a $90,000 life insurance policy. And so, looking at this, who had a motive since they were assuming this was staged? And the first person they thought of is Nikki. If her mother dies, she gets this $90,000 life insurance policy. And, at the time she wasn't working. As we mentioned, Nikki was disabled. It's unclear if Daniel was working, but we're not talking about people that are coming from particularly well-off situations. So $90,000 could be a lot. And that's what the police thought, that this was Nikki's plan to get that money.
Not to sound crass, but wasn't Nikki's mother very ill? I've read she was even terminally ill. So if in fact Nikki wanted her mother's money, doesn't it seem, you know what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say this without sounding like an asshole. Basically, like, why would she kill her mom when her mom was probably going to die anyway? Is there an eloquent
No, it's a great
way?
point.
Is there an eloquent way to say
No.
that, though?
And Nikki and I have talked about this. I mean, it doesn't, her mom she was going to die. She was terminally ill. It doesn't make sense for Nikki to do that. And especially in the context of her mom being her only friend, her only confidant, besides Daniel at this point. But it doesn't make sense. She was going to die anyway.
I agree. It's hard for me to wrap my head around that, especially given that her and her mother had a very loving relationship by all accounts. So it doesn't even seem like money would even be a motive for somebody like Nikki, who had such a relationship with her mother.
Yeah.
So within a few days, a search warrant was secured for Daniel's parents' home, and both Nikki and Daniel found themselves in an interrogation room. Maggie, do you know anything about what went on in that interrogation room with Nikki, or how long the interrogation was? Did Nikki say anything that was incriminating?
No, in fact, I can't really find much on it. And Nikki has said she wasn't really interrogated. There wasn't much, from what I understand, much of a questioning process. It was kind of just, they thought they did it, and that's where it was. What I do find interesting is that once her and Daniel were arrested and in jail, they were still allowed to talk to each other, which I thought was a really odd thing. I don't know if you came across that. I don't think it means anything for this case, but it kind of just shows how unprofessional maybe the investigation was from the beginning.
Or you could look at it as strategic, because they wanted to hear what they were going to say. Because, everything they were talking about was definitely being listened to and read.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. I thought that was a very strange point.
Yep.
And I bet, they expected that one of them was going to turn on the other, as we normally see in cases like this. But both of them, they said they were innocent from the beginning, and they never wavered in that.
Never.
So the evidence that was collected after the warrant is they found a box of insurance papers, and they also found Daniel's hunting jacket and boots, and these were taken from his parents' home. And these would become very important later on during the trial. From Linda's trailer, cops collected a robe that had been hanging in Nikki's closet. So it's clear this does not seem like very much evidence at all, but regardless, only a month later, on April 18th, 1991, Nikki and Daniel were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial would begin in January of 1992. And Nikki and Daniel were both tried together, although they had their own lawyers. I was surprised that these two were tried together. I don't know if you have any insight into why that decision was made. Was that a financial reason? I know they had their own lawyers, so it seems...
Yeah, I'm not actually sure on why they were tried together. But yeah, that's not usual.
Yeah. Research tells us that when people are tried together, you're often going to find that they're both going to be found guilty because the cases kind of bleed into one another. But regardless of that, it's also shocking that the trial only lasted 3 days. So we have an idea with the prosecutor's motive. They seem to think that Nikki and Daniel were after the money. Did they have testimony from anyone that would corroborate this theory?
The only person that really, quote, corroborated would be Jan Terrell. So Jan Terrell is Linda Hawley's friend, Nikki's mother's friend. And she was also the second beneficiary of the life insurance policy. And she had said at trial, that Nikki had called asking about the life insurance policy. We don't know if that's true or not. Even if she did, it's a very benign thing to ask about when your mother is dying and you're trying to get your ducks in a row. I mean, my mom has shown me where the life insurance policies are, that wouldn't be odd if she asked about it anyway. But that was, quote, this evidence against her that she asked about this life insurance policy.
So Jan could have killed her also then for the money, right? So if we're going to look at Nikki as having that motive, then why can't we say Jan had that motive as well?
Absolutely. That's the entire point.
Unbelievable. Also, there was some focus on Daniel's boots and jacket because they were covered in blood when they were sprayed with luminol. But Daniel was a hunter, is that correct?
Yes.
And it could have been deer blood. And in fact, later we'll talk about how it was revealed that it was not human blood. But they didn't even, it almost seems like they saw that there was blood on these items and they automatically just assumed that Daniel was wearing these items that day. And there was no witnesses and no CCTV, no indication that he was even wearing the clothes that day. Let alone if you're a hunter, you're going to have blood on your boots and your jacket anyway.
We don't even know if it was blood because luminol reacts to different substances. So, as many of your listeners know, but for those who don't, luminol reacts to any kind of biological. It could be spit, semen, blood. So they just sprayed this luminol on his jacket and it got a reaction. And what was presented at court without further testing on, is this even blood? If it's blood, is it even human blood? Was just, this luminol reacted, it's blood, and it was Linda Hawley's blood. Though those leaps are not only concerning, but dangerous, and how we wound up here. So the prosecution presented that there was blood on this jacket when, in fact, there was no further testing to determine that.
So let's just say that this wasn't junk science, which it clearly is. This evidence, it doesn't seem like it should even be presented as the evidence that it was, but it's interesting. Like, how does this even implicate Nikki then? If, at this point, they could have said it was Daniel. But I think this shows how if Daniel's guilty, then Nikki's guilty in the eyes of, I think, the jury probably.
I think so. I mean, they were together, and that's their partial alibi, right? They were together that whole day. They went back to Daniel's house. I forget if Rachel, Daniel's mother, I know she testified. I forget if she had said, yes, she saw them there, but they were together. Yeah. So that's good for them as an alibi, but at the same time, it implicates both of them.
That's a good point. So what was the defense's approach here?
The defense didn't really have a great approach. So this was the 90s, and we're just really in the infancy of DNA. So something like luminol, and the prosecution coming out and saying this is blood is pretty explosive and convincing for a jury without the extra steps that we now know we need to take, which is it actually blood, and what kind of blood is it? So this was a precarious time for forensic science, particularly DNA.
So you mentioned that the only thing the defense really had was to present alternate suspects. If I read this correctly, Linda had been dating a man who possibly was involved in law enforcement, so that was thrown around. There was also a similar crime in a nearby town that had occurred not long after, so it's possible that there's a misconnection here. So it seems like there's enough reasonable doubt.
Yeah, and actually the interesting thing about that, going back to this murder in another town, it was the murder of a woman named Bernice Rankin, similar age to Linda Hawley, woman living alone. It was only 30 miles away. And the police officer, actually the detective in that case, felt so strongly that these two were linked. He came to trial hoping to testify, but he was barred from testifying. The prosecution objected to that. But he really thought these two cases were linked. He actually reached out to the Magnolia police to say, hey, I also had this murder. Let's figure this out together. The prosecution wasn't having it. But there were some strong suspects, or allegedly some strong suspects, in the Bernice Rankin case. And they weren't looked into for Linda Hawley's murder.
Was that case ever solved?
It was not solved.
It was not. Okay. So regardless of these alternate theories, on January 13th, 1991, Nikki Zinger and Daniel Risher were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. 2 years later, in 1993, both Nikki and Daniel filed an appeal with the Arkansas Supreme Court requesting a new trial. And they had several grounds to appeal. Do you know, was Nikki optimistic at this time because of so many grounds that they were appealing on?
That's a really great question, actually. I don't know if I asked her ever if she was optimistic. But I would, just knowing Nikki, here's the thing. Knowing Nikki, she's always been really optimistic and really her place is not in prison. So I would imagine.
Yeah. So let's break down some of these issues on appeal. For one, they cited insufficient evidence to support a conviction, and they questioned the propriety of information given to the jury about the weight given to circumstantial evidence. Now, this seems like a pretty broad issue on appeal. I wouldn't expect that they would have gotten granted on this issue. The other issues raised included giving a jury instruction on circumstantial evidence other than the model instruction, which was approved by the court, allowing into evidence a photograph showing several stab wounds with wooden probes, illustrating the entry of the wounds into the victim's body, and lastly, refusing to allow testimony suggesting that someone other than those charged may have committed the crime. And that goes exactly to that gentleman that you were just talking about who showed up at court that day. On this point, the court said, quote, does no more than create an inference or conjecture as to another's guilt. But why is that a problem? I think that's exactly the point, is that if there is an inference as to another's guilt, it should be allowed.
Right.
And then lastly, a person convicted of a felony had been allowed to serve on the jury. The Supreme Court countered this by citing that no potential juror was asked during jury selection whether he or she had been convicted of a felony. Therefore, no potential juror knowingly gave a false answer to any of the questions during selection. Ultimately, the court upheld the original conviction. So it seems that Daniel's family continued to pursue any legal action they could. And from what I understand, Daniel's mother spearheads this, including getting the Innocence Project of New York involved. And they had agreed to have DNA testing done on those boots and that jacket. And the test results showed, not surprisingly, that this was not definitively human blood. Now, any idea why Nikki didn't have support, or did Nikki try to go to the Innocence Project, or how come just Daniel is pursuing this?
Because Nikki doesn't have anybody. Linda was her only person. Nikki didn't have friends. Nikki didn't have any other family. I think that's something I really try to stress when I tell Nikki's story is she didn't have anyone. She didn't have this outside world of Facebook friends or, people she could reach up to. Her mother was her entire world. She didn't have siblings, she didn't have cousins. So it was Daniel and her mom. And her mom is dead and Daniel is in prison. And fortunately, Daniel did have his mother, Rachel, who I just found out did pass away recently. So Daniel and Nikki are both now left with no one. But so Daniel did have this outside force. He had his mother. I believe there was also a cousin who made his website for him. So he was the one doing all of the reach out and getting these projects involved. Nikki just didn't have anyone to help, anyone to bring her outside information and even say, hey, these places exist for you.
And she probably, she probably wasn't savvy enough to do it on her own.
Well, of course. I mean, and in the 90s, there wasn't even let me just Google it.
Yeah.
So how was she supposed to find out about any of this?
Yeah.
And again, it's just when you realize how little she had, how she had nobody, it's just mind-blowing as to why would this woman kill her mother.
It seems to me that if Daniel's case got overturned, though, then that would work in Nikki's favor because it seems either they both did it or neither of them did it. Would you agree with that?
So I would agree with that. There are cases that we see, like the Ryan Ferguson, Charles Erickson case, where Ryan's been out for over a decade and Charles is still a convicted felon. Ryan's been exonerated for over a decade and Charles is still a convicted felon. So
good point.
I would think yes, but that's not how it always happens.
That's a good point. So in 2016, it seemed like there was some hope for Nikki because based on the new DNA findings that I just mentioned, Daniel and Nikki were both granted a parole hearing. The parole hearing unanimously recommended them both for parole. And this is pretty rare considering that neither of them, to my knowledge, have ever expressed remorse and they have adamantly denied any involvement. And of course, I don't expect them to express remorse if they are in fact innocent for these crimes, but it's very rare for a parole board to grant parole in that circumstance. Have you seen other cases like this?
No. So this is really, really unique. As you mentioned, it's generally impossible to get parole if you're proclaiming innocence because they always want you to show remorse for your crime. That's, the golden rule of parole. Are you remorseful? And it's just so counterintuitive. How are you supposed to be remorseful for a crime you didn't commit? So it's honestly shocking that they not only got a parole hearing, but were granted parole.
But while that looked like a great win for them, they got subsequently denied by the governor as the Columbia County prosecutor, David Butler, had written to the governor about the case. And let me mention, he had not even been the original prosecutor on the case. However, his letter to the governor was pretty strong. It stated, quote, This is a no-brainer for me. We object to a commutation of sentence. We have been inundated with comments and contacts from the community who also strenuously object to this commutation of sentence. Now, is this true? Is the public really up in arms about this case?
Not that I'm aware of. People in that state, like I mentioned, for at least 5 years, I've been actively trying to find her representation. People in that state don't even know who they are. So, and Nikki says that too. She's like, when I get out, I can't go back there. And I'm like, Nikki, no one knows who you are, which sounds awful, but
for
she's
better or for worse.
Right. And she's so afraid of this reputation and people. And I just don't think that's true.
No.
I mean, maybe back then it was, but
I don't think so. And I even went on Reddit because, people on Reddit have opinions. And I was like, if the public's outraged over this potential parole hearing, I'm going to find it. And I didn't find anything.
No.
So I'm just curious why this prosecutor has so much hatred towards these two individuals that he is going out of his way to make sure that they do not get granted parole. Also, the Columbia County Sheriff, Mike Lowe, also let the parole board know that he was opposed to the proposed commutations. So, though parole was possibly right in their future, Nikki and Daniel currently remain incarcerated.
Yeah, he vetoed it for this case, I believe.
So the governor denied it once the prosecutor, actually, he could have denied it anyway. Who knows? So while it varies by state, usually the governor is going to have faith in his parole board. And if a parole board unanimously votes for parole, I think it's rare for a governor to disagree. Of course, it has happened, but it's not commonplace.
No, it's definitely not commonplace. But, here's the bane of this case for me is it's Arkansas. We are dealing with people in Arkansas, politicians in Arkansas who, like Asa Hutchinson, the governor, who denied this parole. They're very conservative, very Republican, very anti-justice, I would take the liberty of saying.
So Nikki has now been in prison for over 30 years and trying to fight for her freedom. And I know, Maggie, that you have been instrumental in that fight. Are you the only person she has in her corner right now?
Yes. So she did have the Proclaim Justice team for a few years. Despite, John Hardin saying he would never abandon her, he fully has. She can't even
can you
get
just
her.
Can you just tell our listeners who John is?
Yeah, so Proclaim Justice took Nikki's case in 2016, and it was an organization that was started by John Hardin. And he's a private investigator, and Jason Baldwin. And Jason Baldwin, as many people might know, is one of the West Memphis Three. So when Jason got out, he was helped out by John. They stayed friends and decided to start their own innocence organization where they have helped get some people out. Most notoriously is Daniel Villegas in Texas. That's an incredible exoneration video if you watch that. So Proclaim Justice did some really good work for a while. But they eventually folded, as a lot of small nonprofits do. And with that, Nikki lost John and the alleged representation she had. And, John claimed that he would not abandon her, as, she has been by many people. And that was, in fact, a lie. And he has. I've been trying to get her paperwork back from him to no avail. I have been trying to reach him to no avail. And I unfortunately, made him sound all right in my podcast. So I'm taking this moment to say that for the past about year, John Hardin has abandoned and not been there for Nikki, despite lying and telling her he would be. So I am Nikki's only person. I am the only person she calls. I am the only person who puts money on her commissary. I virtually have a 61-year-old dependent, and it's really, really tough.
John Hardin, if you are listening, give Maggie what she needs so she can further advocate for Nikki Zinger, please. I doubt he listens to our podcast, but hey, you never know, okay? So I'm curious, before we get into what you're currently doing with Nikki and what Nikki needs, how did you first hear about her case?
I believe I first heard of Nikki's case through John. I had reached out to him perhaps about Daniel Villegas' case, perhaps about another case, because I did cover a couple that Proclaim Justice had. DeMarco Wilson, I covered. Andreas Mascaro, I covered. So, somewhere in there, John must have told me about Nikki. We had a pretty good relationship for a while. Yeah, that's how I heard about Nikki.
Okay. So how is Nikki doing in prison? Because I can tell you, based on my research, according to the Arkansas Department of Corrections website, she has completed several programs and she has earned her GED. It seems like she's trying to take advantage of the programs offered to her, but I could imagine, I know she has some health issues, of course, that are lingering from when she was younger and some new health issues that she has gotten since she's been incarcerated. But how is she doing emotionally, mentally, physically?
Not well at all. I've really, in the past 5 years, watched her physically, emotionally, mentally decline to the point of, she talks about ending her own life now. I think she really lost hope when John just disappeared and abandoned her. Like you mentioned, her health is not great. She's 61 in prison. So she had all these physical disabilities with the club foot, which has led to, she slipped in the shower back in the day and wound up in a wheelchair. So she's very often in a wheelchair or in some kind of device to help her get around. She's currently concerned about losing her toe. They might have to amputate it from health issues. It's unclear to me if it's her diabetes or if it's the club foot or a combination, but physically she is not well at all. And like I said, mentally she is not well at all. And it's a lot to be the only person that's there for her. So I'm also not well taking care of her and trying to, boost her confidence and tell her, it's going to be okay. I mean, how often can you tell that to somebody over 5 years and just constantly see it's not okay? So that's where we are.
Usually I save this to the end, but I think this is a good segue before I get to some other stuff I want to talk about. But how can our listeners help? Because it sounds like Nikki needs some moral support. Nikki might need some financial help. I have an address where people can write her. And Maggie, you'll let me know if this is still correct. Nikki Zinger, inmate number 704-283, 302 Corrections Drive, Newport, Arkansas, 72112. And people can just write her with letters of support. Is that correct? Does she receive any letters?
Yes.
From strangers?
So she does. People can write her. Usually every time I do an episode like this, people send out their just letting her know we hear your story. And that's what I tell people. The smallest, but one of the most important things you could do is just let her know that you heard her story. If we're sitting here talking for an hour, what good does that do unless, it gets back to her or there's actionable change?
Yep.
So write her. And you could do that by snail mail, or you could go on Securus.com. As many people who have loved ones in prison, it's an email service. So you would just have to put in Nikki's name, the prison she's at. And all of this and more, which I'll get to the more, can be found on the Arkansas Department of Corrections website. If you literally just Google Arkansas Inmate Finder, you can just search Nikki's name, Nikki Zinger, and it'll bring up all this information, plus a fun little button that you could donate to her commissary directly if you want to. We have a fundraiser for her, so y'all can help me pay for things that she likes. Like, she has a People magazine subscription, helps take her mind off of things. So y'all can send her money directly on the Arkansas.gov website or through the fundraiser that we have as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll also have linked to some of those in our show notes as well. So before we finish out today, Maggie, as an expert in wrongful convictions, what are the main issues here? We know the top factors that contribute to wrongful convictions. We don't have an eyewitness identification here. We don't have a false confession. We don't have a jailhouse snitch, but we do have some factors. What would you say are some of the factors that stand out to you?
So, obviously the main factor is the DNA, right? If we can get that tested and to conclusively say this is deer blood, their entire case falls apart. Their entire case rested on this blood being human, blood being Linda Hawley's blood. So where Proclaim Justice had left off was trying to get a meeting with the DA. And that had been stalled for years, not having an active attorney. Nikki didn't have anybody pushing to make that meeting happen. So right now, the biggest thing is really getting this evidence that says, we don't even know what this is in front of them to have it tested again. And that's going to be tough. We have a conservative DA. We have Huckabee Sanders as the governor. So that's where she's at. But that's going to make and break this case.
Or, very rare does this happen, but perhaps we have a deathbed confession from the actual perpetrator or perpetrators. We've seen that, again, doesn't happen often, but if one of these alternate suspects, if there's a break in Bernice's case, maybe that could be traced back to this case. So there's some hope. But I see a lot of tunnel vision in this case. Most of the cases you cover, well, most of the cases we cover as well, tunnel vision. I mean, these officers, tunnel vision kicked in the second that they walked into that apartment, and then confirmation bias followed, and they couldn't see anything beyond Nikki and Daniel.
Yeah, and something I want to say, too, is that Jan Terrell, the woman who was Linda Hawley's friend and who was next in line to get the life insurance, well, you can't get a life insurance policy if you're convicted of murder. So where did that life insurance policy go? Jan Terrell did, in fact, get the life insurance policy, and we don't know where that money went, what she did with it. She claimed she didn't want it when she was on the stand, but we don't really know what happened with it. So that's something to keep in mind, too. Someone else did get this life insurance policy. It never went to Nikki. And yeah, I don't even know actually if Jan Terrell is even alive anymore, to be honest.
I couldn't find out. Yeah. I was trying to find out if she was maybe like living large somewhere off of that life insurance money, but
I have never heard anything about it other than she got it and that was it.
Now, as we always say on this podcast, we don't know for sure that Nikki and Daniel are innocent. I know that for your podcast, you're taking a stance. So I want to say here that I do believe that there's a lot of reasonable doubt. I do believe that they were not afforded a fair trial. So many other possibilities were not explored. They were convicted purely on circumstantial evidence. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a miscarriage of justice. And I hope that with your support and with the support of some of our listeners and some of your listeners, Nikki could at least have hope. So I think that's very important to people who are incarcerated, to just have hope that something can happen in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I mentioned, hope for Nikki could even just be you saying like, hey, I heard your story, and just letting her know that people are talking about it and people care. And she wanted me to let you, Amy, you, James, you guys just know that she is so appreciative of you guys, you know, hearing her story and caring to cover it. It means the world to her.
Well, thank you, Maggie, because if it wasn't for you, I would have never heard about this case. And thank you for joining us today, because you've been spending so much time on this case. You really are the expert surrounding Nikki's case. And I hope that some of the burden is lifted from you. I know for sure I will be donating, so I hope other people will be as well.
Thank you, guys.
Maggie, thank you again for joining us today. Listeners, be sure to check out Maggie's podcast, Wrongful Convictions with Maggie Freleng. And Maggie, I know you're always so busy, so I wouldn't be surprised if you're working on some other stuff. So tell us, what's going on in your world?
So we are currently working on Wrongful Conviction Season 4. That's going to be coming out in the fall. Season 3 is airing right now, so catch that. And I actually have a new podcast coming out with Payne Lindsay this year, who I know a lot of listeners know. So yes. I'm very excited for that. It's not going to be Wrongful Conviction, so stay
Well, what
tuned.
Is it? What's it going to be?
I don't know if I guess I could say. It's going to be very Payne wheelhouse, missing and murdered people. Cool. We don't even know the full concept yet, but
I'm not sure where you're going to find the time, but I'm very excited to listen.
I don't know either.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that I got you before you started that project, because I would imagine you won't have time to be doing any guest spots once you start that.
Yes.
All right. Well, Maggie, thank you again. It was so great to chat with you as always. And listeners, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to catching you next time on Women in Crime.
Women in Crime is written and hosted by Megan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonzo. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Megan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime.
Sources for today's episode include Nikki's interviews with Maggie Freleng, Wrongful Conviction with Maggie Freleng podcast, freenikkizinger.org, proclaimjustice.org, Arkansas.gov, KTBS, danielreicher.com, law.justia.com, Nikki Zinger versus State of Arkansas, and the Magnolia Reporter.